Bloom for our conversation about Christianity and the impact of the Enlightenment. So as we look at this, guys, I really think it's really important, as I was teaching this today in class, that we kind of put away what we've learned, right? We've learned about the wave of secularization, the mechanical view of the universe. We've kind of talked about how the age of reason was creating progress. Condorcet believed it was entering perfection. And now we're going to sidestep and look at it from a different perspective. And that's going to be the Christian, how it impacts the Christian. We're going to see it has I would argue, the way I see it, I think it has a negative impact on the institutional church. But on the flip side, we're going to see a unique movement that's based on revivalism. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so when we think about the institutional church, I think of a physical space, right? A physical space where there's a church hierarchy. Catholicism could be a pope, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, and priests, right? Maybe some Jesuits and stuff on the side. Under the Anglican Church, we think of the Archbishop of Canterbury overseeing bishops and archbishops and all that good stuff. Lutheranism, we see that it's actually, remember, according to Lutheranism, Lutheranism is submitted to the state. So again, submitted to the state. It's a hierarchy dominated by the state. And then we're also going to talk about how Catholicism in Spain, France, and the Italian states will continue to be dominated by the state. So state. So the age of reason, the secularization, this is going to be the apex, if you will, of what we've learned from the Renaissance. That this institutional church is really going to become dominated. Okay? And when I talk about the institutional church, I think of people, they go to church, right? They went to a physical space. There's like a separation between their life and the life of God. I in some ways see this institutional church like sucking out the spirituality of it, because it's less about personal engagement and more about the obligation. And then we see the institutional church was one of the pillars of national stability. So when we look at it, it doesn't matter which country we're looking at, it's these individual national churches that create the standard. And we know that the kings are in charge, are overseeing Anglicanism, Lutheranism, and Catholicism. And in doing so, the institutional church becomes more about stability than God. And we see this very uniquely in Catholicism. With the nationalization of Catholicism, you should have, in your power map, you should have looked at the idea how the Catholic Church grew to become dependent on the state. This is the outcome of the Reformation. Think about 1648. The Pope no longer plays any role at Westphalia or international affairs. So therefore, Christendom is on the verge, on the precipice of completely collapsing. So what does the Pope and the church hierarchy do? Is follow the state. And the kings have leverage. They're more important than the Pope. So the kings have gained significant power over the church. And I hope you were paying attention. One of the most important things, think about the abolition of the Jesuits. The King of France and the King of Spain said, we don't want Jesuits here anymore. They're too independent. And the Pope capitulated. Capitulate means to give in. Think about that. That is a moment where when you were power up, and I hope you had a moment of shock that the Jesuits, the Catholic soldiers who fought the Reformation, who reverted Poland to Catholicism, who spreads Catholicism to Japan and China, into the Americas, they were instrumental. We had the Ignatius of Loyola with spiritual exercises, such an important part, and yet the Pope gives a thumbs up, and the Pope says, enough's enough. The Jesuits disappeared for about 50 years. That is because the king was more significant to the Pope than the Jesuits. So during the 18th century, the Catholic Church was more of a state agency than truly a spiritual leader. And what we see in this is, as the church is having this chaotic identity crisis, is how are they going to progress? We're going to see this Catholic piety. And you definitely need to make sure you do a Quizlet set. When we look at the word piety, all it means is the amount of devotion one has for religion. And Dr. Spivot uses Catholic piety here because it was, again, the Catholic Church was more about holding on to power, wealth at this moment. They have little impact on the peasants, the urban dwellers. It's the idea that, hey, you're going to come to church anyways. You're forced. We're the only church in town. There is no competition. So they're going to focus more on the structural issues. So the church became anti-intellectual. Think about Galileo. There was less focus of people studying God and religion. The intellectuals who once were that used to really find their calling in Catholicism, they're going to tap out, where they're going to find other spaces. They're going to go to universities, secular universities. They're going to go to work for the kings. So the church is losing this energy. It's almost, that civic humanism just continues. So with all that, they've lost intellectuals, they've lost power, they've lost size, they've lost connectivity. So in the end, Catholic piety becomes more superstitious than devout. And what Dr. Vogel meant by this is people are focused on external worship rather than personal devotion. I want to feel safe, so what do I need to do? Ooh, I need to give some money to the alms. I need to go to a pilgrimage. I need to do a prayer to Virgin Mary. So instead of really understanding why I believe in what I believe, Catholic piety was about these actions. And in general, the average Catholic did not grow in their faith. Rather, they completed superficial rituals in hopes of becoming saved. Catholicism, this institutionalism, it's almost like a dead religion at this moment. Now, if you're a Catholic and say, hey, Watson, are you bashing Catholicism? I will tell you, this will be the norm for the 18th and 19th century, but something supernatural maybe occurred around 1900. And we'll see how that plays out. Because Catholicism today is uniquely different. But I would think this Catholic piety is more of the outcome of the Reformation, the reactionary policies, and just the fear of losing power. But on the flip side, Protestantism, they have something called revivalism. And revivalism is this emotional concept in which one can meet God in a single decision. Revivalism is this Protestant movement in which people believe that at a split second, a decision can be made for God. And as the institutional churches were being just like boring, right? The Anglican church, boring, non-spiritual, more about stability. Protestantism found an emotional movement. And remember, guys, Protestants are reading they're reading the Bible. Catholics aren't. Remember, that's why Bell was so important. And in doing so, Protestants were able to find their own understanding of Scripture. And that's what Pietism, again, different than piety. It's a form of piety, obviously. But Pietism is defined as a Protestant movement that focuses on fostering an individual relationship with God. It's really spiritual. It's the idea that you can have a mystical relationship with God. The founder of this movement is Zinzendorf and the Moravian Brethren. Zinzendorf was this individual who believed that God had mystical parts that a rational mind cannot understand. So therefore, he said, he who wishes to comprehend God with his mind becomes an atheist. He's like, hey, if you're spending all your time trying to rationalize God, you're going to lose God. Because God is an emotional truth. And this kind of format occurs with John Wesley. John Wesley was this kind of important, he's probably the most important 18th century Christian leader. I would even argue more important than any pope or any other religious leader we can look at. He was a random Anglican priest in the 1730s, and Oglethorpe, the founder of Georgia, decided, hey, we have a whole bunch of criminals here who need to be saved. They need religion. So they said, hey, John, come on over, and we want you to preach Anglican faith to them. Well, when he was on a boat on his way to Georgia, a storm hit. And when that storm hit, he wasn't sure if he was going to live or die. And as he was kind of going crazy like everybody else was, he looked over and there was a group of people praying silently. So he's trying to save the boat. And this group of people were just praying. At the outcome of that storm, he goes over and goes, what were you doing? Weren't you worried about your death and your life? And one of them, it was a member of the Moravian Brethren. And he looks at John, and this is reportedly just said, who was it for us to save ourselves? God is in control. If he wants to kill us, if he wants to take our life, he will die and take our life. If he wants to let us live, he will let us live. And at that moment, John Wesley said, I want that faith. That is what I want. And that's what gives birth to Methodism. It's an 18th century movement based on mysticism, revivalism, and the belief that salvation was a moment away. The Anglican Church really opposed it because, again, if you start talking about mystical truth, it's outside of reason. It can create too much individualism. So the Anglican Church really was not excited about that. They thought it was emotional, mystical. It was outside truth. But John Wesley was far too popular with the average Englishman. So therefore, they just had to put up with him. And when John Wesley finally does die in the late 18th century, Anglican Church separates, creates a permanent schism, and Methodism develops out of that. I would dare say that John Wesley would not recognize the Methodist Church today in the way because it's not as emotional. But again, that's totally up for you to understand. But that's where we are. So John Wesley, and again, I like the image in the backdrop. You see John Wesley, and look, he's outside. He is preaching a revival, preaching that people are sinners, and they in a decision they can have to be saved. Now, how does Protestant revivalism fit in the Enlightenment? It's kind of a trick question. You're a power map, and you're like, I don't even know, why is this here? Well, it really doesn't. It's the opposite of the Enlightenment. Dr. Spivogel put it here to illustrate the pendulum. This cultural pendulum is swinging from cold-blooded mechanism to this emotional revivalism. Think about it. This is the opposite of Holbach's materialism. It's the opposite of what Condorcet said in his Progress of the Human Mind. He was saying, Dr. Spivogel uses it here to say, hey, that people were tired of this. This is evidence that romanticism was on the way. The general population was tired of the mechanical, rational era, and they sought another extreme. And that's where we see it. So now let's quickly talk about what we finished. The institutional church was the victim of rational enlightenment and the continued secularization. I talk about how spirituality was sucked out of it, right? The church was confused on how to meet people's spiritual needs as it was trying to hold on to power. Only in the Protestant states was there a window for the emotional revival. And in the end, the 18th century Catholicism will see a dwindling population. The only time that you saw big population turnouts were on Easter and Christmas. Those were the have-to days to go to church. But Protestantism will continue to plateau. They're not really going to increase in numbers, but they won't lose in numbers because they have met a spiritual need according to how they see the world. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, you know what to do.